Recording in progress.
Okay, hello and welcome to the Beyond Center's October Ask a Physicist webinar. I have a few quick announcements before we get started. Firstly, this is being recorded and we will post it on the Beyond Center YouTube channel sometime this week, so feel free to share it with anyone you think might be interested. Secondly, next month is our last Ask a Physicist of the semester, although we will pick it up again in the new year. It will take place November 29th at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, and the title is What is Reality? So be on the lookout for the registration links over your email or social media. If you have any questions during this webinar, just please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and we'll get to the questions towards the end of the hour. And with that, I will turn it over to the moderator for the evening, Maulik Parikh.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome everyone to this evening's episode of Ask a Physicist. We are going to have another hopefully spirited debate, and our first speaker is Professor Paul Davies. Professor Davies is Regents Professor at Arizona State University, and he's also the director and founder of the Beyond Center for Fundamental Concepts in Science at ASU. Most of you are probably repeat visitors here, so these introductions are perhaps a little unnecessary, but let me say again that Paul is famous for his creative ideas in a great number of different fields. I know him from his work on quantum field theory in curved space-time, where he literally wrote the book on the subject. But he works on everything from cancer to astrobiology as well. He's also the author of numerous books. His most recent books is available now on Amazon and has come out to some great reviews, and it's called What's Eating the Universe? But today's topic is there a shadow biosphere? And Paul will, I believe, make the argument that yes, there is or might have been. Thanks, and take it away, Paul.
Well, thank you very much, Maulik, for that kind introduction. And it's a sign of old age that I so often begin my lectures these days by saying, when I was a student. And I'm afraid I'm going to do it again because it's relevant to the subject matter. So when I was a student, which was a while ago, in fact, in a previous millennium, then there was a widespread belief that life is unique to Earth. So in those days, and I'm talking now about the 1960s, I was a strong enthusiast, let's say, advocate for searching for life beyond Earth. And one might as well have said, let's go look for fairies, because it was considered self-evidently absurd to think that something as complex and specific as life could have arisen more than once in the universe. And that view was captured very well, I think, by Francis Mr. DNA Crick, who said in the early 1970s, he wrote that life seems almost a miracle, so many of the conditions necessary for it to get going. Jacques Monod, the Nobel Prize-winning French biologist, he echoed those sentiments by writing that, somewhat sexistly in today's terminology, man at last knows that he is alone in the immensity of the universe, out of which he rose by chance alone. So the view then was very much that life is, is a fluke, a dream run of chemical reactions, each of which is so improbable that putting them all together would make it virtually impossible for this to happen twice. And it was very hard to find anybody that took seriously the notion of life beyond Earth. The SETI project, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, was considered a bit of a sort of crackpot venture. That had started in 1960, but really very few people took it seriously. Then we fast forward to the 1990s, and the pendulum had swung dramatically. It was then fashionable to say that the universe is teeming with life. In fact, Christian de Duve, another Nobel Prize-winning biologist, coined this wonderful term, life is a cosmic imperative, so that wherever conditions are like those of Earth, it will sort of necessarily bubble up. So there's going to be life all over, and the subject of astrobiology is devoted to looking for it. And that remains the prevailing view. There are many rather extreme expressions of this confidence. So, for example, Stephen Hawking once said, "To my mathematical mind," and then it went on to say something like that to think there's no life out there is ridiculous. And that argument, well, the universe is so vast, there's got to be life out there somewhere, isn't really very helpful, because, of course, it's simply a matter of mathematics that if the universe is infinite, of course, then obviously there's bound to be life out there. But that's not what we want to know. We want to know what is the probability that there is more life within our galaxy, for example, and that we could find that life. And the answer is that we don't know, because we don't know what turned non-life into life. It remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of science. We hope that in the coming years, some of us, and maybe some of you who are watching, will come up with a plausible answer to that, and we'd be able to estimate the odds of non-life turning into life. One of my favorite quotes is that of Charles Darwin, who was pressed once on how life came to exist in the first place. And he said, it's mere rubbish at this time, speculating about the origin of life. We might as well speculate about the origin of matter. And it's interesting that we physicists have now explained how matter came to exist, but we haven't explained how life came to exist. And the problem is, if the process that you are trying to estimate is unknown, you can't come up with the odds. You can't estimate the probability of an unknown process. If you know what it is, you can have a go at estimating it, but we don't know. So I'm going to play devil's advocate, really, because I'm a contrarian sort of fellow. So when I was a student, nobody believed life beyond Earth, so I thought, well, that was a good thing to put your faith in. Now everybody seems to think the universe is teeming with life, and so my feeling is, well, hold on. What about all those arguments? What about that derision poured on me back in the 60s and 70s? Did those arguments just go away? And so if I take the optimistic view, that is the prevailing view among astrobiologists, yes, the universe is teeming with life. Yes, it's easy to make. Yes, it arises readily in Earth-like conditions. Well, there's no planet more Earth-like than Earth itself. And so if life began on Earth readily, and it certainly began rapidly, we know that, but if it began readily, then surely it should have happened many times over right here on our home planet. Well, how do we know it didn't? Has anybody actually looked? And the answer is, in fact, no, not really. Nobody has taken very seriously the notion that there might be more than one form of life on Earth. And when I came to Arizona State University in 2006, the very first workshop that the Beyond Center held was looking for a second sample of life on Earth. What has become known since as the shadow biosphere. That was a nice term coined by the philosopher Carol Cleland. So we now talk about the possibility of a shadow biosphere. What does it mean? It means that not all life on Earth is the same life. All life so far studied is the same life, that's for sure. It all has a common biochemical basis, very similar genetic basis, and so on. Clearly has a common origin. But almost all life on Earth is microbial, and you can't tell by looking what those little microbes are. You have to delve into their biochemical innards. And the truth is that microbiologists have classified only a tiny fraction of microbial life, let alone cultured or sequenced. We really don't know what they are. And so is it possible that among that vast unknown population of microbes is a subset that represents life, but not as we know it? How might it differ? Well, there's a whole spectrum of possibilities, but I'll give you one where it will be open and shut, and that's the notion of mirror life. Supposing that life is based not on left-handed amino acids and right-handed sugars, but on right-handed amino acids and left-handed sugars. When I say right-handed sugars, think of the double helix of DNA. It's a spiral like this that turns clockwise, and that is what I mean. Now, the laws of physics don't care when it comes to chemical bonds, clockwise versus anti-clockwise. You could make a molecule of DNA wound the other way. It wouldn't violate any laws of physics, but nature has chosen to break the symmetry in a particular way. Now, because all biochemical and molecular and microbiological techniques are customized to life that we know, then the chances are they're not even going to spot anything like mirror life. But if you found a microbe that was a mirror version of its molecules were the mirror version of the familiar ones, it would be very hard to argue that there would be a common origin. It would look absolutely certain that it had to have arisen independently of known life, a second genesis. Then there's a sort of sliding scale of differentness. That would be very different. But we can imagine another form of life that might have also be based on DNA and proteins, but the DNA might have other nucleotides of the sort that synthetic biologists can now manufacture and insert into strands of DNA. We know that's possible. It might have a different suite of amino acids. All known life uses the same 20 amino acids, but there are hundreds of amino acids, and there's no particular reason why others couldn't be incorporated. And so if we found another form of life that used a different set of amino acids, and for the DNA to talk to the proteins, there is a genetic code. The biological or genetic information in DNA, in the genes, is encrypted. And there's a table, you can look it up on the internet, and it will tell you the coding assignments that enable the 4-letter alphabet of DNA that contains instructions to talk to the 20-letter alphabet of proteins. And it has to be translated for that to happen. All this is well understood. But that particular coding assignment, nobody knows why it is as it is. There are a vast, 10 to the 80 or something, number of different possible coding assignments. And we could imagine another form of life that had a different genetic code. If we found this other form of life, another microbe, then there would be a lot of squabbling about, well, they did have a common origin really, and that's for the future. But meanwhile, I think we should go look for it. And I just want to really say one more thing, because I'm throwing a lot of ideas out here, and we can come back in the discussion, which is that a lot of people feel the best chance of finding a second genesis is to go to Mars. That there's a chance that, certainly a good chance there was life on Mars, maybe, I would say a slim chance that there may be life there today, perhaps deep under the ground. And so there's a lot of interest in trying to find life on Mars. And if we went there and found it, wouldn't that be the second genesis we all want? And the reason we want a second genesis is because if life has happened twice in the solar system, then surely the universe is teeming with life. And there will be some sort of deep life principle that is operating throughout the universe, which would be a very wonderful thing to believe in. I'd love to believe in it, but I want somebody to demonstrate it to me. So we might go to Mars and find what we think is a second genesis there, but it turns out that Mars life is just boring old Earth life that's got there from here in impact ejector, because Earth and Mars are hit from time to time by comets and asteroids with enough energy to splatter rocks all around the solar system, and cocooned inside those rocks, microbes could be very comfortable in the harsh conditions of outer space. So they could easily make the journey from Earth to Mars or Mars to Earth. So in this pandemic age that we live in, we would say Mars and Earth are not quarantined from each other. They cross-contaminate, they trade rocks, and they would trade microbes as well. So we might go all the way to Mars looking for the second genesis, only to find it's just Earth life there. So we might as well look here on our own planet for the second genesis, because I think there's just as much chance of finding it here as there is finding it on Mars. So that's the basis of my argument. It doesn't have to be one other sample of life. It could be that life has started 50 times. The issue is only whether any descendants of a second or subsequent genesis are still alive today, maybe all around us, maybe right under our noses, or even, as one wit put it, in our noses. How would we know if we don't look? So I think at that point I will stop speaking and hand over to Sara, who's more skeptical of these ideas.
So actually, I'm not skeptical. It's just that I like to be contrarian too. And since you've really convinced me that this could be a possibility, I have to think of counter scenarios. So go ahead, Maulik.
Well, maybe I should introduce you.
Oh, sure. Sorry. I'm going to pull up my slides while you're doing that, though.
All right, great. So we just heard from Professor Paul Davies, and now the counter argument is will be by Professor Sara Walker. She is Deputy Director of the Beyond Center at ASU, and she works on physics and biology and information and all kinds of exciting things at the intersection of various topics like that. And so today she's going to tell us why there is no shadow biosphere.
So I remain optimistic that there might be one, and I am very sympathetic to Paul's perspective that we should be looking for it. But I think what I'd like to do is offer some counter arguments about why a shadow biosphere might not exist, coming from the perspective of thinking a little bit more fundamentally about the nature of life and the way we ask questions about life. So the shadow biosphere proposal is based on the idea that life is a phenomena that exists at the level of individuals, and therefore there might be individuals on Earth that have different chemistry than all of the sort of organisms or human individuals, or whatever kind of way you want to parse up biology today, has as their core biochemistry. But if you adopt the view that life is really a process that happens at the scale of biospheres and is really a planetary phenomena, then there are no individuals, at least over long time scales, because we're mixing genetic information and all kinds of information is being exchanged across species on the surface of the planet. And so it casts a kind of different view on this notion of how we should be thinking about whether a shadow biosphere exists or not. And the second sort of perspective that I'm going to introduce is also not thinking about life as a chemical phenomena, because when we're talking about the shadow biosphere, we're often talking about alternative chemistries for life. And there's good reasons for proposing alternative chemistries for life, because I think neither Paul nor I thinks that life is really about the chemistry. We both agree it's about the information processing. But part of the argument I'd like to make is that some of the constraints that arise from that kind of thinking might indicate that you only have one kind of core chemistry per planetary body for life. So the key argument is already on the slide here, and I've already articulated, but I'm going to kind of run through it a little bit more slowly so we can follow the logic, and then we can debate and discuss in the discussion period. So basically, I'm going to try to propose that there's one biosphere per planet, and therefore there can be no shadow biosphere, because once the original life happens on a planet, it's actually a planetary scale phenomena, and it evolves at a planetary scale, and therefore we don't really have room for a shadow biosphere or another example of alien life on a planet. So part of the initial motivation for this view is just asking the question about what is life. And I think Schrodinger, was one of the first people to ask this. So we've talked about this a lot already in Ask a Physicist in the past. There's this wonderful book that he wrote in 1944 based on a series of lectures that he had given the previous year, asking the question, what is life, and trying to answer it from the perspective of physics. But he made a couple of interesting points in that book that maybe are not even the right framing of the question. So there's this interesting thing in science where we oftentimes don't think a lot about how we pose the question with respect to how we answer the question. So if you ask the wrong question, you're going to get the wrong answer. And one of the things that Schrodinger asked was this question about how can the events in space and time which take place within the spatial boundary of a living organism be accounted for by physics and chemistry. So here he's already made an implicit assumption that when you want to talk about explaining what life is, you should think about what's happening in the boundary of an organism and not think of any scales in space or time larger than that. And so I think part of that sort of perspective has really permeated a lot of the way that we think about the nature of life. And we think that, for example, the cell is a fundamental unit of life, but maybe that's the wrong framing. So when we're asking this question, what is life? Maybe we should be actually asking it as a planetary scale question and thinking about life as a planetary scale phenomena and not thinking about it as a spatial boundary of a living organism, an individual cell. Part of the reason for that is obviously cells are deeply coupled to their environment. So they don't exist spatially independent of anything else, but they also don't exist temporally independent of anything else because they're part of a biological lineage. So you can't just say a cell fluctuates into existence on the surface of a planet or a human. They're part of an evolutionary lineage that has existed on our planet since the origin of life, and all of the information in all of those lineages is connected. So we really have to start thinking, I think, of life as this kind of planetary scale phenomena for that reason. And some of the ways that we do that is actually kind of abstracting away and thinking about life in these kind of more abstract mathematical principles. And so I'll introduce in a few slides this idea of trying to think about planetary scale life in terms of networks, which is something that I've been developing over the last several years with Hanju Kim, who's a research scientist here at ASU and has provided a lot of insights in developing this framework. So just to sort of build on this perspective and say it's not just something that we think here, you know, I'm not proposing this as like an idea in a vacuum. Eric Smith, who is at the Santa Fe Institute for a long time and has been at the Earth Life Science Institute and a number of other places, a very prominent complex systems researcher in Origin of Life, has declared that having a biosphere is a definite state for the Earth, which is positively favored over alternative states devoid of life. So he wrote this book with Harold Morowitz that was proposing that the biosphere is actually the fourth geosphere. And just like we think about the lithosphere, atmosphere, and the oceans as different parts of the Earth system, we should think about the biosphere as a coupled part of the Earth system. David Grinspoon, a planetary scientist and astrobiologist who has thought a lot about the Anthropocene and what we're doing now as far as the human footprint on planet Earth and the impact that we're having as a species with our global technology, has proposed that life is not something that happens to a planet, or is something that actually happens to a planet, not on a planet. So we really need to think about life as being part of planetary evolution, not separate from it. And even here at ASU, we have Everett Schock, who's proposed the idea that the biochemistry on Earth is what Earth allows. So it's actually a geochemically contingent process. So biochemistry is actually deeply coupled to planetary chemistry. It's not independent of it. And if you start thinking from that perspective, it seems to be the case that you would expect a planet with a given geochemical set of conditions to produce a biochemistry or some constraints on the biochemical space. And you can't just have any possible biochemistry that could exist on any planet, because there's a mismatch between the geochemistry and the biochemistry. Another feature that is really important to consider is that living processes do not exist at one scale. They exist across many scales. One of the biggest problems in trying to address understanding fundamental properties of life is that life is not a scale dependent phenomenon. It doesn't just exist in chemistry. It doesn't just exist in DNA or the molecules happening inside our cells. It exists at the level of cells, organisms, individuals like us, E. coli, but also at the level of communities. So for example, people talk about ecosystem scale properties as being really important for defining functional units in life, and have even proposed that the ecosystem scale, the community of organisms interacting, might actually be the fundamental scale for thinking about biological processes. And then, of course, as I've mentioned, we can think about planetary scale phenomena. So for example, life on Earth has been evolving over the last 4 billion years, but that evolution is not decoupled from what's happening on the planet writ large. A very prominent example is the Great Oxidation Event. So photosynthesis evolved and then produced a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, which couldn't be absorbed by the rocks. And therefore, we had this major transition in planetary dynamics where our atmosphere became oxygenated. And what's happening with climate change is another instance of that, where you have biological innovation happening at a rapid pace. It changes global climate, and the planetary system as a whole has to adapt to those changes. So we really can't think about just the organismal scale, where some proteins are invented, for example, that might really couple to global scale phenomena. We also have to think about those global scale phenomena and how they couple back to the organismal scale. So it's a massive sort of hierarchy of these coupled systems that really defines what the biosphere is doing on our planet. And this is probably the key feature that distinguishes non-living and living worlds. And so, Mars is a dead planet as far as we can tell. Earth is a very alive planet. And if we think about life as this kind of planetary scale phenomena, one of the things we have to ask is how much of that is actually driven by the conditions on that individual planet. Maybe Mars doesn't have any life at all on it now, and looking for microbes in some pocket environment on Mars is a lost hope, because we really need to think about the fact that either a planet successfully generates a biosphere through some original life event, or it doesn't. And maybe the geochemistry of the early Earth was ripe for whatever the original life transition was as a planetary scale phenomena. And so there is a lot of work actually trying to think about the original life from this perspective. So this is just one example. So there's an excellent set of literature from a lot of different groups trying to understand how metabolic cycles that are believed to play a prominent role in ecosystems across Earth. So this example is the citric acid cycle, which is believed to be this really primitive metabolic cycle that might have emerged geochemically, because we find it everywhere at the ecosystem scale. Now, a lot of experimental research is demonstrating that all of the steps of the citric acid cycle could happen in a plausible geochemical setting. So the idea here is kind of supporting this hypothesis that the biochemistry we have, the central metabolism that we have in biochemistry, is actually a product of the Earth's geochemistry. It's things that can happen under geochemically plausible conditions. And even in some cases, these might be favorable reactions on the early Earth. So the early Earth was in some sense just primed for life to emerge on it, because these reactions were happening so frequently and so readily. And in that case, there's no special pocket environment on Earth where this was happening. It was in some sense nucleating everywhere that the conditions were favorable. And you can think of this as kind of a planetary transition in terms of the geochemistry transitioning to things we quote unquote call biochemistry, but really thinking about it as a continuum. And so the continuum idea about the nature of life, I think, is one that's very near and dear to my heart. I think Paul and I were among the first people maybe to propose that life really didn't have a hard boundary between non-life and life, and we should really look for a universal physics that describes life and describes the original life transition in terms of information and possibly causation also, which we won't have time to go into today. But the basic premise is new physics emerges with life, and we really need to think about that transition in terms of physics. But once you do that, you see that there's kind of this universal property that might exist in our universe that describes how information behaves. But where we see that physics as being most prominent is at the original life transition and everything that happens subsequent to it. So we have these abiotic systems where this doesn't matter too much. And then in my view, there's this sort of planetary transition, but it's a continuum of processes that then happen on our planet, building ever more refined and more quote unquote complex structures. And eventually maybe our planet will copy itself. Our Earth will reproduce and actually produce conditions that are Earth-like on another planetary body. For example, if we send our technology to Mars and we try to make the Mars habitat more favorable for Earth life, right? So we might actually reproduce at a planetary scale, not just an individual scale. But that has to happen through technology evolving on the surface of a planet. So some of this is really related to the notion of information and how it couples to physical reality. I'm not going to really talk about this slide too much, actually. I just stick this in every talk for the sake of it, but I'm going to skip it for now, but we can come back to it in questions if you want. But this idea of this sort of continuum is that the same physics operates in technology as operates in cells. And we really need to think about sort of that whole large process, the evolution of the biosphere over 4 billion years is an example of what we call life. And everything that the biosphere has produced, including cats and vases and all of these different things, is actually part of life. But things that are alive are actually the things that are actively constructing that process. So I'm alive, Paul's alive, I presume. The cat's alive in this image, but the vase isn't, right? So some of these things require this kind of new physics to produce them. Cats and vases do, but cats are kind of an active participant. So this gets at this idea that we should think about life as a continuum. How this relates back to the shadow biosphere and the sort of arguments I'm making about life as a planetary process is that there's been this mantra in the astrobiology community for a long time that when we're talking about understanding life and also looking for it on other planetary bodies, including looking for the shadow biosphere, we should be looking for life as chemistry, life as a chemical phenomena. And of course, this view is somewhat challenged for the reason that all life on Earth is unified by this common ancestry. So as far as we know, if we look at the chemical components of life, there are these shared components across all organisms and even viruses that have what appears to be a common origin. And so this common origin we call the last universal common ancestor. The singular on that is actually a misnomer because it was probably a collective population of cells on the early Earth. And in fact, I actually have adopted the view in recent years, in part because of my work with Hanju that I mentioned, and a lot of members of our research team, that the last universal common ancestor is actually a planetary scale transition. And it's when you actually start to have this phenomena of having a well-defined life form that's capable of this open-ended evolutionary process and generation of information over billions of year time scale. So the last universal common ancestor is really a planetary scale phenomena. But for the purposes of thinking about life as chemistry, people have traditionally thought about it as this sort of boundary where we can say, well, this is the chemistry of known life. Let's talk about whether that chemistry is universal to all life, or we should talk about alternative chemistries for life. But of course, without a definition for life, talking about alternative chemistries for life is a little bit premature because we don't know exactly what are the constraints and what are the phenomena and organizations that we're talking about as being living. So a lot of people have talked about the fact that maybe the basic building blocks of life anywhere should be similar in generality, if not in detail, but we haven't really been able to formalize what we mean by generality. In the detail, of course, we can say all life should use amino acids or it should have chirality associated to it that Paul mentioned, but we don't know sort of what the general features of that are. By contrast to this concept of universality in biochemistry, we have a concept that is also talking about universality in physics, which is a very different discipline, obviously. But the concept of universality there doesn't deal with specific component parts, right? So in biochemistry, we're saying all organisms use amino acids, all organisms use nucleic acids. Therefore, we have this universal core set of components. In physics, universality usually describes the behavior of systems, in particular, having similar behavior near like a critical point. So I've just given two examples here, but like the liquid gas phase transition and the ferromagnetic phase transition have similar scaling behavior about how temperature behaves at those phase transitions. So there's some, mathematical property that's the same for those systems when you look at them at some sort of average scale and you don't look at the details of the system. And so that feature is really saying, we don't care about the components of the system. When we're talking about universality, we look at these average properties and we see that two physical systems that have really different physics at the micro scale and might have really different properties, like a magnet and water to liquid gas, actually have the same properties when we look at them as this kind of macro scale or this higher scale of sort of their average behavior. So that's very different than how we talk about universality in terms of specific parts. And so one of the things that our group has been doing is basically trying to demonstrate that this concept of universality of physics also applies to biochemistry. And so we don't need to focus on the specific biochemistry of life on Earth. We can actually just focus on the constraints and the statistical properties and say there are universality properties like we have in physics that are more aggregate, average properties, statistical properties of the way the systems behave. And to do that, we've just been looking at different scales of biochemical systems, basically saying, we know life doesn't exist just at the organismal scale. We know it exists at the ecosystem scale and planetary scale. So let's take data across all those scales, do statistics on it, and see if we see any patterns. And so this sort of field that we're inventing is called planetary systems biochemistry. And there's been a lot of students in our group involved in it. And as I mentioned, Hanju's been really critical to this. And what we're trying to look at is basically looking at all of the reactions that biochemistry uses and the molecules biochemistry uses, and then demonstrating there's some properties that change very systematically with the size of the biochemical system. So if you get a bigger system, you have some predictable property in the biochemical system. These are actually related to the properties of biochemical networks. So networks are these interesting phenomena, like you and I are connected in a network right now because we're part of a social network, and you can draw molecules as being connected to other molecules in a network by drawing an edge between them in these kind of graphs as they're connected by a common reaction. And one of the interesting features of this is if you see sort of common scaling behavior across these networks across scales, it suggests certain robustness properties. And this was one of the reasons that we started to think that maybe there wasn't a possibility of a shadow biosphere, because if we look at the scaling behavior, it's very systematic for individuals' ecosystems in the biosphere. But if we start randomly smashing chemistries together, we lose that robustness and that scaling behavior of real biochemical networks. So if you imagine you had a biosphere and a shadow biosphere, and you smash them together and you wanted to look at the structure of the chemistry across these scales, it would look very different than what we actually observe in biochemistry. But what we observe in biochemistry is associated traditionally with being robust properties of highly networked and integrated systems. So it's a little bit like, if you're thinking about the World Wide Web, there is obviously a shadow web, but there's a dominant global ecosystem of people on the internet because it works for a very particular reason, that you want to exchange information across the planet. And we need to have this globally integrated system for a global civilization to function. If you want to think about life as a global phenomena, these networks actually have to be coupled in a very specific way in order to function across all these scales. And we've even done some preliminary experiments looking at the idea of a mirror biosphere. So if you have networks that have, one chirality and you merge them with the other chirality, they don't mesh well and they don't actually look like they have these consistent properties that we see for real life. So we can think about sort of, the 4 geospheres I mentioned, and also the technosphere, and that life has, consistent properties, thinking about across all these scales. And, really what's happening in the biosphere is a chemical instantiation of these network systems that we see maybe in the technosphere today. So just to conclude my main argument, the coevolution of life and planets might only allow one global solution per world, which is geochemically contingent on the conditions on that planet. So some planets like Mars might evolve just to be dead because they don't have a, geochemistry doesn't favor this kind of open-ended network system that we talk about as being life, whereas other planets like Earth might emerge a biosphere, but that biosphere is a unique solution for that planet. And that is the end of my set of arguments.
Thank you, Sarah. And with that, we'll open the webinar to questions. So we don't have a lot of questions right now.
Could I ask a couple of questions first?
Okay.
Getting quickly. So, Sarah, I understand what you're saying, that if life is a planetary phenomenon, then, one planet, one form of life. But if we consider say Earth and Mars, good example. So life gets going on Earth. Mars is Earth-like, 3.5 billion years ago. And microbes from Earth drop on Mars, and they think, well, this is fine, this is like home. Then it's not a planet, it's not a top-down planetary emergence of life. It's something drops in from the sky and spreads. Now, it's never clear to me whether, with your planetary version, whether that's a possibility, that panspermia, and it could happen the other way around. It could be that life started on Mars, plonked onto Earth and spread. So that's one question that I have, because that's really a bottom-up view.
Yeah.
Do you want to answer that first? And I have another question.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the thing there is usually we think we could put like an individual species on Mars and it might survive. But that would actually require a lot of engineering for it to be able to do that, like enzymatic engineering and all kinds of other things. So the way I think about it is probably if you really wanted to put life on Mars and have it survive, it would have to be an ecosystem, which I know you've already proposed that kind of idea, Paul. But you have to think about like how much of Earth do you have to take with you in order to be a sustainable system. And then when you take that ecosystem to Mars, there has to be some geochemical compatibility because the food resources for that system, the pH that those organisms grow at and everything else also has to match conditions on Mars unless technology and actually engineers it to be able to do that. So I have this sort of conjecture that maybe it is possible for ecosystems to be transmitted between planets non-intelligently, but the possibilities of a match between the biochemistry and the geochemistry are probably quite low. But when you get to the technological phase of evolution, the probability of that matching becomes much higher because technology obviously has the intelligence to engineer that into a system. So I think this kind kind of proposal is basically panspermia is possible, but much more likely with technology than just with biology. But of course, technology can't do anything that the laws of physics don't allow. So biology should be able to do it, just lower probability.
So you could make a strong prediction that if we ever do find life on Mars, it would not be terrestrial life. It would
Right.
be
I think so. Yeah.
That's question number one. Question number two is, people often say, well, what is my scenario for multiple origins of life on Earth? And here's one. Imagine that the Earth settles down and life gets going 4 billion years ago. And it has, a few million years to settle down, and there's microbes everywhere, and it's a planetary phenomenon. Then slam, along comes a really large impactor, sterilizes the surface of the planet, boils the oceans, flings a vast amount of material into solar orbit. And inside that material, this life is comfortable enough for a few million years. And then the Earth settles down, and it's a planetary phenomenon, and this planet's there, and it does it again. And so life too is there. But then back comes life one, and now we've got 2 forms of life on Earth. And that could go on many, many times. And so the question is, so that's one way in which you might generate a shadow biosphere. And so then the question is, would you expect one form to predominate, eliminate the other totally?
Yeah.
Or can we imagine that there's still a shadow biosphere lurking there? So
yeah,
that's a concrete scenario.
I think it's a great thought experiment. I guess my supposition based on the arguments I made would be that when we look at ecosystem scale properties, there needs to be some overlap in the biochemistry of the individuals in order to have this kind of scale.
Peaceful coexistence.
It's but it's actually a sort of, it's not an evolutionary argument. It's more of like a robustness, self-organization kind of argument that when you look at network systems, there's certain network structures that are robust and certain ones that aren't. And so that, this is how people design the internet to be robust against attack and things. They have certain, kinds of structure for these network systems. When you look at that, in order for individuals to have that robustness property and ecosystems, we think they have to have some overlap in the chemistry of individuals. Otherwise, the ecosystem will just not be robust over long time scales. But we have to demonstrate that. But I think it's a hypothesis that emerges from the work that we've already done on thinking about life in this kind of planetary way and trying to understand the properties of the networks.
One last quick remark, and then we'll take some other questions. That therefore, in terms of planetary protection, you feel that we shouldn't worry about bringing microbes back from Mars because our planet is not suited for them. If it's a planetary phenomenon, they won't do very well here, and we could just worry about all the possibilities.
Right, but I guess I would still worry if they were like a pathogen or something. Like over the planetary phenomena argument works on long time scales, right? But like the traumatic impact to humans, if it happened to be a pathogen over short time scales, might be too much there. So, yeah.
So perhaps we ought to take some questions from our viewers.
Well, let me, there were a couple of questions that we got from viewers. So one question is from our ever reliable Barbara Temple. And that question is, I'll direct all the questions, I think, to Paul. Could the shadow biosphere actually turn out to be Earth's native form of life, while life as we know it came from Mars? So we sort of touched upon this question already, but
yes, we did.
Yeah.
Yes, Barbara, I think that I've long toyed with the idea that Mars was a better planet for life to get going initially, because it was a smaller planet and so cooled quicker, was ready for life sooner. This is not an overwhelming case, but there are 2 or 3 aspects of the early Mars that would seem to make it a slightly better bet for life to get going. This is hampered by the fact that we really have no idea just what does it take in terms of the biochemical setting and the sequence of reactions and so on for life to start. And we must always be open to the possibility that the conditions for life to get going, so over here, might be very different from the conditions needed for it to be sustained over the longer term, over there. I could imagine a scenario in which life would start readily on one type of planet, but wouldn't really be sustained and would need to be transported to another type of planet. So maybe it got going on Mars and came to Earth. Maybe it got going on Earth and went to Mars. Maybe it got going on both. And then, as you say, it could be that that life as we know it is originally of Martian origin, or it could be the other way around. So I'm open to all these possibilities.
Great. And another question that was asked by email was if alternative biochemical implementations of life were eliminated by the Great Oxidation Event, can we then find evidence for a shadow biosphere if this existed in the early geological history, say from 4 billion years ago to 2.5 billion years ago? So this is asking really whether that shadow biosphere may no longer exist, but can we find things in the record?
It would certainly be difficult. It's very important to understand that organic molecules don't fare well on Earth. You can find ancient organic molecules in, for example, in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, but they're all mashed up. And so if you wanted to find, something distinctive like a ribosome, you can't go back millions or billions of years and expect to find it sitting inside rocks. So the question is, what would be the evidence of an early alternative form of life? So this book of mine called What's Eating the Universe, we might say, well, what's eating the Earth? Did something eat the rocks or any other resource on the surface of the planet that doesn't correspond to life as we know it? So that's one way in which you might find evidence, something strange that went on. Looks like it would have to be life responsible, but the biochemical pathways of known life wouldn't do it. That's about all I can guess. So there is one other possibility, of course, which is that the early bombardment, which is flinging a lot of material into space, if we ever find a terrestrial meteorite, say on the moon, and there will certainly be some there, could early Earth life be fossilized in it, and might it be preserved better on the moon than on Earth? It will certainly have escaped the Great Oxygenation Event. So that's just off the top of my head. Those are the things I would think. Sara, do you have any ideas about how we might find ancient alternative life that's no longer around?
I mean, I think I'm interested in finding traces of it in the life that exists. Like if we had sophisticated enough inference tools for looking at sort of chemical patterns and what they are, we might be able to see these signatures of these dead species, but it's already hard enough to do that within standard biochemistry, right? So we have phylogenetic trees, which are the relationship between all organisms on Earth, but we construct those based on what exists today, and we're losing a lot of the past information in constructing those. So I would actually start with trying to just construct within current biochemistry predictions about past life that went extinct, and then try to expand those tools to things that were alternative biochemistries.
Could we imagine a hybrid thing where you showed that lovely picture of the tree of life, and I'm saying, well, maybe they're two trees.
Yeah.
But could we imagine that somehow, even though they were independent origins and really pretty different at the start, they sort of one swallowed the other or something, and so contemporary life has, if we could really trace it in detail, sort of a branching the other way, go back in time, and has two or multiple roots. I don't know how you'd untangle all that, but I suppose it's not impossible.
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, sometimes I think like maybe there were sort of multiple events happening and they kind of converged in what we call the last universal common ancestor, but that might have, taken root in multiple different ways. So you could think about the origins of life as actually being, multiple events across the surface of the planet. And Freeman Dyson had that nice garbage bag model. I don't know why he called it that, model for the origin of life, where you had viruses emerge, or a virus-like genetic system and a metabolic-like system, and then they converged at some point in early evolution and became what we call life, that has metabolism and genetics. So I think some of the speculations in that space are definitely within the realm of possibility.
We're so used to thinking of life in terms of competition, read in tooth and claw,
Right.
that this idea of cooperation or the alternative forms of life sort of striking a deal and merging and, win-win leverage. It's an interesting one, but we should take some other questions perhaps.
Yeah, here's another question. Maybe Sara can take this. If there were multiple biospheres on the same planet, would they compete with each other? And it's directly related to whether they compete or collaborate.
Yeah. So I think, obviously it's all up to debate and speculation, which is why we're having fun here tonight. But I think my conjecture is if first off, there wouldn't emerge multiple biospheres on the same planet because life is geochemically contingent. So there are certain features of the geochemistry on a planet that are conducive for life forming. And then life is a direct pathway through chemical space from the geochemistry to the biochemistry. But assuming a scenario like Paul proposed, where you might have life come in from the outside on an asteroid, or maybe life, was indigenous to that planet, got ejected, and then a new biosphere emerged, and you had two biospheres on a planet, I think over time they would converge to a common biochemistry for these reasons that the system might not be stable over long duration unless there was this capacity to have these systems, to have these kind of properties that are robust across all these different scales.
I think Paul has a question or a comment.
No, I was just looking at the Q&A and the question about whether universes could reproduce or multiply themselves, and I can't resist throwing in a comment on that, because there certainly has been an idea. If you believe that the origin of the universe was a natural event, that's the first thing, and if you also believe it was a quantum event, which seems to be very fashionable, then we can imagine that there could be other big bangs, which often people describe as giving rise to bubble universes. There could be other bubbles, bangs going off scattered throughout space and time. And if it's a natural process that is triggered by or mediated by quantum mechanics, then a sufficiently advanced technology could manipulate that same quantum physics and create its own baby universe, if you like, creating a universe in the lab. So we could clone this universe, or we could attempt to clone it. We could create another universe with the same laws and roughly the same initial conditions. It wouldn't be an exact replica, of course, but it would be a pretty good try. And of course, we're but one step away from the conjecture that maybe our universe is precisely the product of some such bubble nucleation or cloning event, or creation by an advanced technology in a preceding phase. And so we sort of lurch off into the outer realms of speculation and I might say religion, because it's very little different from
well, you can even go further and say, well, if every universe is sort of destined to eventually create civilizations that can spawn off more bubble universes, then they're going to all reproduce, and if those copies are not exactly faithful copies, then we will have a sort of diversity, and then basically you can apply evolution to that.
Right, and that's at least Maulik is rather, sorry.
Yeah.
I was going to say, Lee Smolin has rather famously suggested that maybe if stars collapse to form black holes, and then instead of the material of the star hitting a singularity and ceasing to exist, goes through some sort of wormhole and bursts out in or creates another bubble universe from that event, but that there is some sort of random variation from the laws that prevail in our universe. So this bubble universe is slightly different. And then, of course, if the reproduction event is the collapse of stars to form black holes, then those universes that maximize the number of stars, collapsing stars, are going to predominate in this vast assemblage, this multiverse of bubbles. And so that's a sort of type of Darwinism. Differs from standard Darwinism because there's no direct competition. The universes are not sort of slugging it out, in competition for food, but they're simply outbreeding each other. So the ones that, it's no surprise that we live in one that has lots of black holes. I hope I haven't maligned Lee Smolin's ideas, but that's sort of roughly what he was saying.
We have a number of questions that have come in. We only have a few minutes left, but let me pick among them. Kevin Clicky asks, if time allows, Sara, could you elaborate a little on the axis of your figure on robustness across various scales?
Yes. So this kind of comes from some arguments about sort of the stability of networks. So when you're thinking about network systems, a lot of times people talk about hubs. So these are like nodes that are very highly connected in the network. So they, in a social network, they might be somebody that's very famous or very popular. So for example, I think Mark Zuckerberg still has, among the largest number of connections on Facebook. So he would be a large hub on Facebook, which might have to do with the fact that, of the early evolution of Facebook and him being prominent on that platform. So you can have, and in metabolism, we also have hubs. There are things like water and ATP, which is an energy currency, that are connected to a lot of other molecules via reactions. So a lot of biological networks have this property of having these very highly connected nodes and having a few of them, and then many very, very low connected nodes. And that's been associated to those networks being more robust, because if you randomly take a node out from the network, you're not going to disturb the overall features of that or many of the paths between different molecules, because you're very, in biochemistry or in a social network, many people, because you're very unlikely to hit one of those very high connected nodes. And so some of the robustness features that people often talk about with networks are associated with these power law or very heterogeneous networks, where you have some things that are very highly connected and many things that are very low connectivity.
Okay, here's another question. Where on Earth gives us the greatest potential to discover evidence of a shadow biosphere? Paul?
Yes, well, after this workshop in 2006, we wrote a paper in which we outlined a strategy for finding shadow biosphere, and there are really two quite different scenarios. One of these is that this shadow life is comfortable in physical conditions which are beyond the scope of known life. And I'll give you a classic example. It's very easy to understand. Known life is comfortable in an enormously wide range of temperatures, from about -40 up to 125 Celsius. The deep ocean volcanic vents do host organisms that are metabolizing well above the normal boiling point of water. It doesn't boil because of the pressure. But the temperatures of the fluids coming out of those vents is up to 300 degrees or more. And so if what you found is that life is continuous right up to, say, 125, then there's a gap to, say, 145, and then you found more microbes living from 145 to 165, they would stand out. They're isolated in parameter space, is the way I would express it. And there are about half a dozen parameters relevant to life. You've got things like pH and temperature, pressure, and so on. And so if you find any form of life that's isolated in parameter space, you'd zero in on that. That would be your candidate. And so you want to look to places where known life is uncomfortable. I've just given you one. Others might be high UV flux or extremely saline conditions or extremely metal contaminated conditions. All of these places, life is very good. Life as we know it is very good. The so-called extremophiles can tolerate extreme conditions, but they all have their limits. So that's the one thing. That would make it easy. Where it would be much harder is if shadow life was comfortable in roughly the same circumstances as known life. And so the two forms of life would simply be intermingled in a way that would be very hard to tell apart. So you look under a microscope, say a cubic centimeter of seawater or soil or something, it's teeming with life, millions of microbes, thousands of different species. If among a million microbes, 128 was some different form of life, it would be very hard to spot. Because as I said earlier, you can't tell by looking. You've got to delve into the biochemical innards. And then the only hope is that we create some sort of filter that would slow or even kill known life. So anything that carries on would be some alternative form of life. And I mentioned earlier about mirror life. why not have a neutrino medium of mirror molecules that known life would find indigestible and mirror life would guzzle? Well, that experiment's actually been done, and it did lead to the discovery of a new organism, but unfortunately it wasn't mirror life. So that's a rather flawed example, but it gives you some idea. If you could just find an agent, nothing as drastic as, say, bleach, but an agent that could screw up the biochemical processes of known life. So anything that still ticks is going to be this type of shadow life. Those are the sorts of strategies we have in mind.
Thank you. And there are more questions now, but we are just about out of time. I'll take the one question, which is a one-line question. Does every black hole contain a singularity? It has nothing to do with today's talk, but the answer is yes. That's the content of the Hawking singularity theorems. But if you fall in, you don't necessarily have to fall into the singularity. There might be ways out into another universe. That's an open question. And on that note, I hope you'll join us in a month's time at our next and last for the last webinar of the semester, and that will be on what is reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Maulik, and thank you everybody for listening and watching. See you next time.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye.